Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by Get Around Caboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Road Rules 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project, and let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I'm here in the studio with Sara Stace. I know Sarah because actually I heard about you first through a radio program on Radio National, Big Ideas, a panel discussion about Bendigo. Then somebody introduced me to Better Streets, and then I found out that Better Streets is your project. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. I'm a member of the Better Streets Slack channel. Perhaps you could say where you are, how you became interested in this whole area.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on this show. So, yes, I'm Sara Stace. I'm joining from the land of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, otherwise known as Sydney. How did I come across this? I've always been someone who loves being outdoors. I've always been someone who rides to school and rode to uni and rode to work for transport, and I jog. So as a citizen, just my passion for being outdoors. When I was working at Infrastructure Australia, they asked me to write a paper for the board on what it would take to do a cycling strategy, how we get more people cycling and walking in Australia. And that really set me on a whole new pathway that I didn't even know existed as an issue and a challenge here in Australia. So I wrote that, and then that led to writing the National Active Transport Strategy. It's called Walking, Riding and Access to Public Transport. So I've worked in this field ever since then. So that was about 16, 17 years ago now. And I've just kept going. So I've worked in federal, state and local government in those sorts of areas, as well as in the not-for-profit sector, like with Better Streets and with the World Cycling Alliance, which is a global body where I'm treasurer of the board.
I don't know the World Cycling Alliance. What is that?
It's the global body that represents all cycling organisations that are for everyday cycling. It's not around racing or the type of riding or road cycling. It's about transport, everyday cycling. So that might be Bicycle Queensland, Bicycle Network, Bicycle New South Wales, We Ride, etc. Could all be members of the World Cycling Alliance. And we have at least 150 organisations globally. And our secretariat is run by the European Cyclist Federation, and we're registered in Brussels. We're a not-for-profit. Our board comprises one member from each continent. So I represent Oceania, and then we've got East Asia, West Asia, Africa, North America, South America, and Europe. It's quite hard to have our board meetings because we have to find a time when everyone's available. Essentially, the World Cycling Alliance is representing everyday cycling. So we are represented at the COP negotiations, the most recent one being number 29 in Baku in Azerbaijan.
All I hear about COP29 is how difficult it is to get consensus. It's become a thing which in many ways is hampering the desire that it started out wanting to change. What is it like to be in a room full of power brokers and negotiators and lobby groups? What's it like to be in that space?
I haven't actually been there. We were represented by the European Cyclist Federation, who did attend. My understanding is that they basically lined up in advance their full agenda of who they were going to meet, which topics they were going to attend and so on, and then prosecuted their case that way. So whilst I guess the objectives of the COP29 overall have been really disappointing, I think some of the commitments you get through things like cycling, so saying cycling is an everyday form of transport, getting added into the wording and things like that is really, really important. I think the breakthrough for that came through in a Dublin COP a couple of years ago, where they did actually add an additional sentence at the very last minute that basically said, yes, we recognise cycling as a form of transport. Now, that may not seem particularly profound for anyone else on the planet, but at least it's starting to put that recognition in on the global stage. And I think that sort of advocacy is really, really important to do for governments.
And it is one of those things that when you're in the community, you don't see changes, but there's all these policy documents that come from those kinds of interactions and experiences. Because I've often wondered what it's like to go to one of those huge events. And it just goes to show that even if, say, the federal government may be against cycling, that local groups still have really good power. So what it says is that even though maybe overall there haven't been as many gains as perhaps a person might like, nonetheless, you can make small inroads, which does shift the needle little by little to make it that much better for whoever does want to include that in their policy.
Yes, exactly. And that helps to then create hooks if you do have that on that global stage and it gets put into some wording, it creates a hook for other organisations, other governments, other levels of government indefinitely, because you can go back and refer to that and say, well, this wording says this, and that gives you a huge imprimatur to just go ahead and get things done.
So what is Better Streets, and how do you include the World Cycling Alliance, or do you include that in there?
Better Streets could be a member of the World Cycling Alliance, and so that's something that we will get around to at some point. Basically, Better Streets is essentially an alliance of other organisations. Our mantra is that we want to educate and connect and empower the whole community, whether that's community groups or businesses, decision makers and individuals, to create more effective better streetscape outcomes and giving them all the tools they need to do that. Essentially, we represent organisations ranging from sort of concerned parents and citizens group, the school group, school teachers and principals. It might be about the climate. It might be people who are concerned that there's a particular crossing on their street that isn't there. We've got some school kids if they want to have a crossing moved closer to their school gate. So we're really representing a really broad spectrum across the whole community. And we're united around these 5 key recommendations. So the first one is to get kids active. And we want to set those lifelong healthy habits for kids and also reduce the impact of local traffic around schools by getting more school children to walk and scoot and bike to school and catch public transport. Our second key recommendation is that streets need to be easy to cross. That's part of, I guess, making it easy and convenient to walk by having more crossings added each year by councils right across Australia. Our third recommendation is we think it's really important to slow vehicles down. That's really the way you're going to get local neighbourhoods to be quieter and safer and more inclusive for everyone is if you've got reduced speeds that are survivable if someone gets hit by a car. The fourth recommendation we have is we want to support and boost local businesses, and that's through making shopping streets more welcoming and enjoyable for people to spend time in and enjoy being there, just hanging out really. And then our fifth and last one is making it easy and safe to ride a bike. We want to be able to make it easy for people of all ages and abilities to get on a bike and ride through their local neighbourhood or get to school or wherever they need to go. So there are 5 key recommendations to become an alliance member or partner. Essentially, you're just signing up to those things. We've found that even motoring organisations find that extremely palatable. There's no particular reason why they don't support that. The idea behind that is by having a united voice, you get a lot more traction. There's a couple of origins behind that. One of those is when I was working in the Australian government and writing the national policy for walking, riding and access to public transport, there were a couple of groups representing cycling, but there was really hard to get an organisation that nationally represents walking. And even within the states, there was Victoria Walks at the time. I don't think Queensland Walks was around then. There's no equivalent really in New South Wales and so on. So it was hard to get feedback and input from these different organisations because it simply didn't exist. And the closest we could get was the Heart Foundation, who are really excellent in this area, but it's not their core business. So there was a clear gap across Australia. And the other one I found is that it's very easy for politicians and bureaucrats to dismiss people who represent walking and particularly cycling because it's seen as an outer group where really only 1 or 2% of the population. How important can this really be? And so there's a mismatch between what public actually wants and what the politicians hear or kind of filter through. So by being an alliance and working together, you get a much more clear message and louder and amplified message about, no, this actually really matters to a lot more people than just because they like being on a bike. It's because it's really fundamental to a better society.
That's actually really important. So the thing that I always think of is I ride a bike because I don't own a car. I don't have a high income and all my money goes into get around Caboolture. So that's the end of my very limited funds. I live in an area where there's a lot of people on low incomes and a lot of single mums who have kids who can't afford a car because a car is $10,000 to $15,000 a year. And if you're on Centrelink payments, you just don't have that cash.
Actually, Wendy, I think it's more than that. I think the Australian Automobile Association has said that the average household in areas that are quite car dependent, the cost is around $25,000 a year for transport costs. Once you add in depreciation, where people have got a loan on their car, tolls in some states, etc., it's phenomenally high. We just don't appreciate the cost that has on households. It's just an average of households in general.
That suggests that some households where it's car dependent have 2 cars and some cars have 1 car. Yeah, and then some have 5 cars, because everybody has to get around. I had no idea it was such a broad support and avenue for policy making. So thank thank you very much for doing that work, because it's often quite thankless. And I know from my experience, people want it to change, but they don't want to step up into that space to make that change because we're all busy, we've got things to do. And I think it's also about lack of confidence.
It's time, obviously, and not knowing what to do. And I guess because I've been working in this space for a decade and a half, and I've come at it from pretty much every angle, apart from being an actual politician. I've worked in, as I said, in all three levels of government trying to get this through. You can't solely blame the federal or the state or the local councils for what the issues are. There's a fair bit of blame there, but not all of it. And then you can't only blame NIMBYs and the community. You can't blame consultants, etc. But at the same time, everyone is involved in creating that sort of ecosphere, I suppose. But on the other side, none of them can singly solve it either. Wendy, another reason why we created this is because my last role in state government, I'd been working really hard to get a big economic business case up for investing in cycling for a huge network right across the whole of Greater Sydney. And we'd worked with 33 councils to co-design that network. We'd won an award on doing that co-design process. The business case said that for every dollar you spend, you get $5.20 back. Like everything just completely added up. And yet it didn't get through. And I was really curious about why did that not work? The response I got back from a very senior executive basically said, look, Sarah, you've done all the right thing as a bureaucrat. You have got the evidence, you've got buy-in right across different agencies, you've done the business case, you've proven it works, you've done everything you can. And there is a line beyond which the politicians need to hear this from the community. The community must be proactive. And they need to have a voice that is very loud and clear to the politicians to say, we need this. And one of the problems about the way we tend to do community consultation is we're asking people to react. We're saying, hey, we want to build this cycleway right here. And the only time they get to say anything is in reaction to this. We don't give people the opportunity to be proactive. So I guess with Better Streets, I'm trying to close that loop on the ecosystem to say, we've got the bureaucrats doing all the right things they need to do. They're getting the consultants on board. They're preparing all the business cases and so on. They're demonstrating that can be done and needs to be done. The community now needs to step up instead of the politicians. If you take the bold choice of putting in this cycleway or making a streetscape upgrade or putting in their crossings or slowing street speeds down, we will be there to support you every step of the way. I don't know of other groups who do that, but that's exactly what we're trying to do. And that's why earlier this year we had Lee Waters out from Wales where they brought in 30 kilometres an hour because as a politician, he got piled on by the community to say you shouldn't have brought it in. And I guess if that had happened in Australia, I would hope that Better Streets and other organisations like us and our partner organisations would step up and be extremely vocal and go into the defence to say, we're here to be unequivocal about our message that we support this change. I think that's really important to give that level of confidence to politicians.
So just for our listener who may not be aware of who Lee Waters is, so Lee Waters was the Transport Minister for the country of Wales in the United Kingdom, and we actually had Rod King on our show in a previous episode. I encourage our listener to go to the episode with Rod King because he does step it through. Basically, the speeds were really inconsistent across the country and there weren't enough places which did have a slower speed. That's how it became that all roads should be 30 kilometres an hour. And it was that blanket statement that caused so much of a backlash. It's interesting though, because now all those places, their fatality rates are much lower. It doesn't take up so much space in the hospitals then. You have more kids riding bikes to school, but there's still this community backlash.
My understanding is that backlash was only for the first 3 or 4 weeks. So if you went back to some of those locations now and said, oh, we want to increase your street speed, they actually might want to keep it quite slow, in fact.
I had a friend of mine come on and she lives in Oxfordshire and she drives quite a long distance to her workplace across England. She said she just felt this panic at not being able to go faster, but then she realised she didn't have to grip the wheel so tightly. She's a car driver. She's not interested in cycling or walking. Yes, she goes for walks in the countryside, but she's a driver and she was saying how much calmer she felt having arrived at her destination in a calmer way. But that initial rage for sure is difficult. One of the other things is some work with Gil Penalosa.
Yes, I interviewed with him earlier in 2024, and you're welcome to go listen to that on the 8 to 80 channel. What I was talking about is what does it take to make change in our streets? So there's a really lovely framework that the Dutch Cycling Embassy created about 2015. I think it was Lucas Harms prepared it. It's quite a simple Venn diagram that says that when you're wanting to get this change in cycling cycling and walking, you need to have hardware, which is your infrastructure, the cycling infrastructure and crossings and so on. You need your software, which is your strategy and guidelines and funding. And you need what he calls orgware, which is essentially the political support, the community support and the advocacy who give that very positive and loud support for change with a clear message. So that's like a framework that we like to work within. But I've also read a book by Greg Zattel called Cascades, How to Create a Movement that Drives Transformational Change. There's a few really amazing lessons out of it. And one of them is that he talks about these 3 building blocks for change. So one is that you need this vision, clearly articulating what success looks like. So when I described those 5 recommendations for better streets, we've actually got KPIs for each of those things. So we want 75% of school children to be able to ride, walk and catch public transport to school, because that used to be the case 40 years ago. And we want 20 additional crossings per council a year, being very clear about what does success look like. The second building block for change he talks about is that you need to appeal to the majority of people. And that's where I mentioned that the problem with cycling is that because it's only the fearless riders who are riding now, maybe 1 to 4% of the population will ride on a road with cars going fast. So if we think that cycling only represents them, it will never make the transition to the broad majority of people. He talks in particular about these thresholds of resistance. Wendy, you and I, we would sit in the passionate advocates end. It's like the early adopters. We need to find those people who are interested but concerned, make them feel comfortable and included, and make them attracted to the cause. Politicians need to hear from them, the unlikely ones, not from you and I, because it's pretty obvious what we're going to say. So I thought that was a really, really, really interesting. And then that's why he talks about making sure you've got this broad spectrum of allies who relate to others in a community. And then the third building block for change is saying that you need to create these coalitions as pillars of support, and they would need to be in government, industry, academia, community organisations and so on, which again is why we've got that Better Streets representing this broad coalition, including some unlikely bedfellows who you might not necessarily expect, but they're the ones who will get that attention of politicians saying, okay, I didn't expect that, but that's really interesting that the School Parents and Citizens Association is a partner. Tell me more. Those 3 key building blocks for change I thought were really fascinating and have very much shaped how I think about how we create the type of environment that helps to enable that change across Australia and away from motor normativity.
I was also very inspired by Cascades. I'll put a link up on the show notes. And what I got out of it was actually how important it is to create fun. I think us advocates, we get passionate, we're really quite earnest, and we don't have that sense of fun and lightness and creativity. And I had this idea that we should go on a clown bike ride. Everybody wears a red nose or a funny top or something like that to make it a bit lighter, those sorts of things. I did see that there were some roller skates and they were going out in bride and groom outfits. And that sort of thing I think is really fun.
I've got a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who used to be on the US Supreme Court. Her quote is, "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." And so that is that element of fun or joy or laughter and feeling included and welcome, I think is just so, so important.
I wonder whether people in the community are a bit disenfranchised because we've all been called customers for the last 40 years. Because when you're a customer, you know, if I go down to one of the stores and they say, "Thank you for being a customer," I feel very passive to the process. And I feel being a customer at council, which I'm not, I feel like I'm a resident and I'm a community member. I don't feel like I'm a customer.
And customer implies that you've paid for something or that you're living and existing. I mean, it's similar with using words like cyclist. I don't consider myself a cyclist because I think Michael Colville Anderson says, well, we all use vacuum cleaners, but we don't call ourselves vacuum cleaners. And the same with walking, trying to move away from calling people pedestrians too. They're just people, or they might be people walking, but we don't need to call them pedestrians. We don't need to call us people who are riding bikes cyclists. You might refer to them as people who are riding bikes, people who are driving. We don't need to kind of label people into a particular category because it creates division.
People who go shopping, people who live in an area, people who ride a bike, people who walk, people who are driving. Yeah, not those drivers. You can hear instantly that that's got division, those cyclists. You can hear instantly how that gets people's backs up. If somebody is in councils, everybody has very tight roles. It's very hard to break out of the box. It's very hard to get your voice heard, particularly if you're more junior, what is something that you could suggest maybe a junior officer at council could do who's interested in getting more bicycle paths and better foot? What's something that you think they could do to make the space better?
It's a very good question. It's tricky for people working in government because it's hard to know where to draw the line between your role as a bureaucrat and an employee of, say, council in this instance, and for advocating for better. And I have, when I've been in government, been accused of being an advocate. And I rang up one of my former bosses, who was a bit of a mentor of mine in government, and I said, "Oh, I've been accused of being an advocate." And he was like, "Sarah, that's absolutely fantastic. It is your job to advocate for good policy." So he said, "Don't be offended. That's the best thing you can be called, because you represent the taxpayer, or in the case of councils, ratepayers. And if you know, based on evidence and what people are asking for, that having more cycleways or better footpaths is what the community wants, then it is absolutely your job to do what you can to achieve that, because you're speaking on behalf of residents and ratepayers." In terms of what you can actually do, a few things is look up what is the council's written commitment. What have they said? In New South Wales, they have what's called a community strategic plan. So it's a 10-year plan that's been created by the community, and that's all legislated. And then that then drills down into their operational 1 and 4-year plans and so on. So look at what's actually in there as statements, because that's your hook. Whenever you're doing a council note or briefing, you should be referring back to those things and demonstrating how it fits with those. And that's hard to argue because that's what's been agreed and stated publicly to the community. The other thing you can do is work with your local organisations, if there is a walking or a cycling advocacy group or business chambers of commerce, to be talking to them. As long as a member of staff, you're not acting with a conflict of interest and you're declaring it up front. So it may be that you say to your manager, "I would like to go and meet with this organisation, this community group, to hear what they have to say," and perhaps even invite your manager along if they're interested. There are ways that you can at least get those other voices in the room and listen to them. And then it may also be a matter of trying to find the funding and so on, or it might be that you've got supportive councillors. So some councils have got an advisory committee or an equivalent thereof that is around active transport or cycling. And so you might use them as well as a forum that'll often have members of the community and councillors on board. So you're bringing them along for the ride as well. And it may also be just going and having a coffee with someone in the state government and saying, "Look, I want to get this done, but I don't know how to do this." In New South Wales, there's a community of practice of council staff and the state government staff to try and share some of those ideas. So some of the things that I would look at for a junior council member of staff to look at what are the things they can do to affect that sort of change. If it's about joining an advocacy group in your own council, I think that is crossing a line. You can be a member, but you shouldn't be active. And you certainly shouldn't be sharing any trade secrets from your own organisation. What I have seen happen successfully is where you've got a very passionate member of staff in a council and they join a cycling advocacy group in another council. That's fine, because you're not running counter to your own organisation, but you are in danger of crossing a threshold when you are advocating within your own council area very strongly with an advocacy group. I think you need to be careful about where does that boundary lie and who do you represent? So I would caution against that.
That's good advice. Say, listener, and the person I always choose for this question is my friend. She's stuck at home with 2 small kids, 2 small boys, and she's got no money, no time, feeling at the end of her tether most of the time. And she would love to be able to get better infrastructure. She's reached out to her local councillor, who basically said, yeah, there's nothing we can do, because she's got a major highway outside their sort of small little area and it's at 100 kilometres an hour. In 20 years or whatever, they're going to build a major highway through there. What is something that she could do that perhaps could have a more optimistic outcome?
I think where I've seen it effectively work for a member of the community is a few things. One is to try and build a bit more of a coalition of people within the area. So I've seen a parent do this once where they set up a page and then told other people about it. In this instance, because it was trying to get a crossing in, because people who were in cars were parking or not seeing the traffic signals. It was right outside of school and so on. So she was getting people on the Facebook page to basically post photos that they took and the time that an incident occurred, so that when the council did finally get around to getting a consultant in, because the consultants will often look at traffic or a problem for a few hours and that's it. And then they'll say, well, we didn't observe any problems. The brilliant thing about this is it was cataloguing with the community the problems and when it was occurring and what was occurring, so that when that consultant finally was in, they had a much bigger database. Now, you could do that through all sorts of things. We've got a really clever guy who works with us called Jake Coppinger, and he's created some online things where you can track things like traffic signal timings, for example. So that open source. And Better Street, we do have a program that we'll be putting out fairly shortly. It's a platform where you can log things on a map anywhere in Australia. So you can do that for basically requesting your council for change. One is sort of getting that social media and then mapping and cataloguing issues, because when you demonstrate how risky and problematic it is, councils don't want to have to handle risk. So they will try and clamp down on risky problems. And then the third thing is you really need to go and meet with your elected representatives. My advice is go and find the wards. So every council in Australia is divided into wards. So find your ward councillors and don't email all of them at once. Contact them one by one. You can send them an email, but don't do them all into one. Ideally, you want to get them out on site with you. So your friend should get them out with her on the street and walking and saying, I'm with my kids, and then get them to feel what it's like, because there is no evidence that it's strong from a community member saying, this is what my daily life feels like. That's probably the most powerful component, is get the ward councillor out there or the mayor or whoever you can get out with you and experience that with them. You can go for a state politician, but I think you first want to lobby your local ward councillor, because it's harder to get the state politician unless it's their electorate. If it's their electorate, then get your state or federal politician as well.
So we're coming up towards the end of time. It's been great. I've really learnt so much more about what you do and the breadth of it. Also what Better Streets does, because it's always nice to know what you do. And I think in many ways it's a bit like working in an organisation. Well, I know what I do, but I had no idea that there were all these other things happening as well. Just before we close out, are there any other closing remarks, final thoughts, anything else you would like to share that we haven't touched on?
Yes, with Better Street, particularly in your community, and you don't have an advocacy organisation that represents exactly what it is that you're wanting to. In the case of your friend on the busy road, she could actually set up a Better Street for her own local area, and she could name it after the major road or the precinct or neighbourhood that she's in, and they can use their logo and everything is all completely open source. We do have resources on our website. So if she wanted to, she could actually create a Better Street for her local area, and then everything is just open source. We own nothing. It's all sharing is caring. Tools and resources are all available for anyone in Australia to access and use, and there's no trademark or anything else like that that's associated with it. You just go ahead and use it, as long as you agree with those 5 key recommendations that I set up front. And the other one is we're hoping to do more training materials this year. So we'll have more resources and a training academy and things like that, so that people can build up their skill set for advocacy for Better Streets in whatever capacity they want to take on.
That's great. Before we came on air, you said you were going to be starting a new initiative. Was that Better Streets or was that something else?
So I've just started up working with 2 other colleagues. There's 3 of us working in a company called Vivendi, and essentially it's similar to what I've been doing for the last many years in my work, essentially providing advice mostly to different levels of government around how to get better outcomes for streetscapes, but also helping them with a whole lot of other things like build a compelling economic business case for decision makers. In the past, we've done things like providing advice when you've got, say, transport economic business cases, extremely technical, but you can now value place in those business cases because there's now a method for economists to value place. That's work that myself and a few colleagues did in my previous role, but that's the type of work that I continue to do to this day in my paid day job, is finding ways to work with government clients on improving their understanding and the tools and mechanisms and guidelines they have available to do better decision making and to guide others. I love getting out of bed to do that type of work.
I must say, as much as it is frustrating, this work, I do have a sense that I am doing something that is helpful for the community, even if it's just a very small thing, just in nudging in the right direction. So I totally get why you'd be leaping out of bed to do something like that. So I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming on and spending time. I know you've clearly got a very busy schedule, so it's really lovely that you could make the time to come on and share all these great ideas and all the different initiatives you're working on. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Wendy. And I really love this podcast series that you're running. You've just got the most amazing speakers, so I feel very privileged to be joining.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out getaroundcaboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.